Well, welcome back to the Communication Mastery Podcast. This is episode 13 in our first season, and we're getting close to the end of this season. We've got one more episode after this, and then we'll take a break for a few weeks and start up again in the new year. But today, I thought it would be worth saying, as this episode will launch just before Thanksgiving, watch out for communication challenges in the family gatherings over the holidays. Watch out for what it tells you about yourself, but also what you can learn about others. Remember what we've said before about distress. Many of us communicate in distress because our needs are not met and our filtered questions are not answered, because people don't understand the life languages and how communication works. But as I see distress in another person, remember it's an invitation to make a difference. And the knowledge you've gained by listening to this podcast, and for many of you by taking your life language profile and reading your report, the knowledge you've gained can really help you to make a difference for other people. So with all of that in mind, I thought today would be a good opportunity to look at some of the questions that have come in, questions that I've heard from different ones of you. I've changed the names to protect the innocent, but the questions are questions that have come in from those of you who've listened and those that I've interacted with since we've started this podcast. So we're going to look at some of those questions and see what kind of answers we can come up with that will be helpful to you as the core of this episode. So first question comes from Shelley. And she says, how do I make my communication needs known to others? It's a really good question, because obviously if my need for a certain form of communication or a certain shape of communication isn't known, then it's difficult for communication to be effective. That's the heart of what we've been talking about in developing communication mastery. So the answer I'd give you, Shelley, is that first of all, I think you want to build a bridge so that it doesn't come across as I'm needy and I need you to adapt to me. More particularly, if you show people you want to adapt to them, but explain as you go. I've been learning about communication and the importance of adapting to others. And one of the things I learned about myself is that I need whatever it may be. So if you've begun to understand your communication styles, your communication preferences, you might say something like, so I come to understand about myself that often I need personal space, if contemplator is your first language, for example. Or one of the things I've realized about myself as I've been learning about this is that I really need to feel connected. Could we look at ways where I could feel more connected in our communication? It depends on what issue you're facing or why you're needing to make your needs known to others, but some of those approaches can really help. So that we don't come with the assumption that I need everyone to adapt to me. If I come across as I want to adapt to you, you could even add in and help me understand you better. What do you think you need? Or would you like to discover more of what you need in communication to be effective? Obviously, you know a communication coach who can help with that. But some of that kind of attitude really builds bridges. And remember, that's what we're here to do. It's to build bridges and not to put people into boxes. It's the easiest thing in the world to reject people because of miscommunication or a lack of understanding of communication styles. But what you and I are doing by doing this together is learning to build bridges, learning to adapt, learning all that we can about communication styles so that our communication can become more effective and everyone around us benefits, including ourselves. So those are some of the ways that you can make your communication needs known to other people. Sometimes it can be a challenging conversation to have, and it's worth making a plan beforehand. Go back to some of the communication basics that we've talked about in earlier episodes of understanding what dynamics are in play, of understanding the other person that you need to connect with, what their styles are, and how you can communicate to them in a way that they can most easily receive it. If you want help with that, of course, you're welcome to reach out to me. We can schedule a session and look at that together. Okay, next question comes from Richard, who says, I'm really comfortable speaking my primary language, which is contemplator. How do I grow my fluency in other languages? That's a really good question. And that's the right attitude to have, because remember, all of us speak all 7 languages, at least every week, if not every day. And so wanting to grow your fluency in other languages, Richard, is really good. Because you mentioned that your first language is contemplator, I'd encourage you to think about the other languages in your profile, where they come, how much of them you already identify with, and think about some of the categories and the characteristics, the qualities of each of those other 6 languages that you want to develop. So you focus in on one particular area, one particular aspect, and seek to look for that in your communication or to apply that in your communication. One of the things I found helpful is to pick one language and to try to speak only that language for a time. Now, when I say a time, I don't mean a month or a week, but I mean for the next hour or for this morning. I want to focus in on this language because it's one I want to develop. I wouldn't pick your weakest language. I'd go for something in the middle that you see would be helpful to grow it, to grow your awareness of it. But I would certainly zero in on a language. Another thing that's very helpful, and I do this often when I'm working with teams, is to say, who do you know who's more fluent in that language than you are? See if you can hang out with them. See if you can get to know them. I think I've told you a story about a high contemplator friend of mine. This is a few years back. But he understood that the contemplator needs to work on developing connections and on being able to make those sorts of connections rather than simply keeping to themselves. And so he and I met for coffee before work once a week for a whole long time. And it was very helpful to both of us because I was able to give him undivided attention through that time. But he was also able to work at not just thinking, but actually expressing what he was thinking and building a connection with me. So those are the kinds of things that you can do to increase your fluency in other languages, is to find a friend who's more fluent in a language you want to develop, or who can help you with one of the essential qualities to develop that your primary language has. So again, Richard, I'm speaking about the contemplator because that's your primary language. Others listening to us will have other primary languages. And so the approach might be different. If you're a feeling, emotive primary language, the influencer or the responder, then it needs to go with feelings more than thinking. But what would you feel would be a helpful addition to your communication arsenal, if you like, your communication toolkit? What do you feel would be helpful to add? Maybe you're very good at empathizing with people or wrapping yourself around a cause or a need. Or maybe you're very good at reading the room and drawing other people together. But in both of those cases, being able to perhaps make a plan could be a helpful thing to develop. And so you want to lean into your shaper language. Or maybe it's more to do with managing what's around you, the resources that you have, and you want to pull up your producer language and look at some characteristic or aspect of that. What do you feel would be helpful to add to your feeling language that's your primary, that will give you greater roundedness and greater strength and more ability to connect with people? Some of the time it's actually taking action. It's pulling up either the practical doer or the courageous mover and allowing them to lead you into action and not just feeling and caring and understanding people in that way. Conversely, maybe you're in one of the action languages as your primary language. You're very practical as a doer, or you're very courageous as a mover, and you want to lead by example and you want to improve things for people. In both of those cases, it's easy to become isolated if you're not careful. You may want to pull up one of your feeling languages to give you deeper connections with the people around you. Or it may be a question of pulling up a thinking language, perhaps even the contemplator for the mover, because those two would tend to be somewhat opposites. Leaning into one of those that helps you to see the bigger picture, knowing that it's going to help your action to be more effective and more fruitful. So again, you work with the primary language and look for what will go with it to be the most benefit. So to develop fluency in other languages, you focus on that language. It's a little bit like learning a foreign language for any of us. If you're learning Spanish or you're learning German or you're learning Japanese, you need to spend time, even though it feels awkward, learning how that language is constructed, what its features are, what it sounds like, listening to other people who speak it, practicing with others. All those things that apply to a regular human language apply equally to our communication styles and to the life languages. So I hope that helps you to develop fluency in other languages. Here's a question from Jenny, and this is, I guess, relevant as we're looking at the holiday season coming up. My brother-in-law dominates the conversation at Thanksgiving and other family gatherings. What can I do? Well, Jenny, that's a challenge, isn't it? And it's a challenge I think most of us are familiar with. One relative that's hard to get along with. The first thing I think that helps, remember I think it was a few episodes ago, we talked about gratitude is an ounce of frustration. Gratitude can help to reduce frustration. And so first thing I would suggest is you look at what can you be thankful for in your brother-in-law. Maybe he dominates the conversation, but maybe that's because he's a deep thinker, or maybe it's because he's very action-oriented, or maybe it's because he just loves to connect with people and he loves to be the center of the excitement and the enthusiasm. Any of those situations could actually be something that is frustrating in a family gathering. But on the other hand, if you begin to understand how he's wired, it'll give you some clues to zero in on what can I do that would make a difference. And it may be that you just simply gently need to say to him, and again, it depends on how you define his communication preferences, but you may need to just gently say to him, hey, let me hear from some other folks around the table. It's been great hearing from you, but let me hear from some others, and maybe draw others in who look like they may want to contribute to the conversation, but look for ways to actually steer the attention away from him all the time. Again, I think part of this rests on whether he's operating in a healthy place of just being fully aware of himself and his own contributions, or whether he's in an unhealthy place of being more in distress and crying out for his needs for communication to be met, or indeed for his filter question to be answered. I think, again, I've used this as an example before, but we had a family member who was hard to get along with until we actually were able to have her to her life language profile, and we realized that her primary language was mostly in distress. In this case, it was the producer language, and that language can appear controlling in distress because the need from others is not being met and the filter question is not being answered. So people around this person were not answering the question of, are you managing your life? Nor were they giving the appreciation for the way this person was managing her life. And as we began to address some of those issues, as we began to actually focus on expressing the way we were managing our lives, the way we were being resourceful, as well as appreciating her for what she was doing and how well she was doing the managing and the resourcefulness of that producer language in her own life, suddenly the controlling began to decrease. And it was an interesting dynamic. And again, all of the languages have those kind of characteristics to them. So working out where your brother-in-law is coming from and what it is that's causing that domination will give you keys and clues. Again, if you wanted to have help in working through that, just get on my website and schedule a call, and let's talk about what the characteristics are so that we can begin to identify which language it is. Remember the introductory resource bundle as well. There's a little chart in there, a useful tool of which language are we speaking. So you can begin to define which language you need to focus on in any interaction, whether you know a person's profile or not. Remember that every one of us, we're not limited and restricted by our profile. It's simply a snapshot of us at a particular moment. And just like a snapshot of you could have you smiling, and then today you're not smiling, or it could have you frowning, and today you're happy and you're not frowning. In the same way, there are ways that our profiles don't limit us. We may be different today than we were yesterday or when we took the profile. So that's what to do with a dominating relative in family gatherings. Figure out where it's coming from so that you can use your understanding to be able to figure a way to build a bridge. Okay, here's a question from John. He says, I feel like I get mixed messages from the voices in my head. How do I disentangle one language from another? Well, I guess I already partially answered that one, John. That chart of which language are we speaking from the introductory resource bundle on my website would help you with that. What it boils down to is to think about or to ask yourself, these voices that I'm hearing, because remember we've said that you do have 7 voices in your head, it's just that some speak louder than others. But is this a thinking voice, or is this a feeling voice? Is this my feeling speaking, or is this my cognitive nature speaking, or is this my practical action or my justice action nature speaking, from the action languages, the kinetic languages? So when you've got two voices speaking at once, the better you know them, the more easy it is to separate them. Any of you have children will relate to this. We had three sons. We still do have three sons. But when they were younger, you could hear when there was an argument or a disagreement, because voices would be raised, and you can hear in the tone of voice, whether you're in the room or not, what's going on. And then as a parent, you learn to discern which child is this. You can hear from the different characteristics of each one's voices who's happy and who's not, who's instigating and who's defending, who's being wronged, or who's losing out, or who's winning and pushing their advantage. All those kinds of dynamics in any gathering. Same thing with the voices in our heads. Once I begin to understand what each one sounds like, if I get to know each of these 7 languages as if it were a person, now I can begin to distinguish between them. And then I can take control over what's going on. So I could say, for example, if I've got I don't know, what would I pick? If I've got my doer and my contemplator are arguing with each other in my head. The doer is seeing all these things that need to get done and wants to start checking things off the list, but my contemplator wants to take more time to think about, why do they need to be done, or is there a specific way that we want to do them? And in those ways, those two languages can start to collide with each other and blend together. But if I learn to distinguish between the two languages from their characteristics, from the understanding from my profile report, from the quick reference guide, for example, the characteristics of each language all listed there. As I begin to learn the differences between them, I could say to the contemplator, we'll think about this later, because my doer needs to get some things done here. Or conversely, I can say to my doer, we will get those tasks finished by the end of tomorrow and not today, so that we can take some time to think about the way to do it, or why we're doing it, or what's behind that need that we need to learn from. So again, we can distinguish between and start to separate the different languages so that we don't blend them all together. I think I've used this analogy with you before, but it's worth repeating. It's very good for us to be able to distinguish between the languages in our own thinking and in our own understanding, so that it becomes like the paintings in kindergarten, where the grass is green and the sky is blue, and the tree has a brown trunk and green leaves, and the sun is yellow. Because then it's a pretty picture. We want to put that on the fridge. But if we blend all those colors together, we end up with this sort of swampy, browny gray kind of mush. And then we're not really attracted to that picture, and it doesn't help us to see what's being painted. So we keep the colors separate. That's a really helpful analogy, at least in my mind, for me to help keep the languages clear and identified in my mind. Yes, they influence each other. Yes, they affect each other in the profile. But if I can keep their characteristics clear and separate, then a little bit like breaking up a disagreement between my 3 sons, I can figure out who I need to give attention to and who I need to speak clearly to in order for this to be resolved in the most helpful way. So hope that helps you, John. Begin to disentangle those languages. And remember the lesson, I forget which episode it was, but we can't do this on our own. So if I can help, reach out to me. I'd be glad to help you further with that. Okay, here's a question from Carol. Which is, I suppose, in some ways overlaps with John's question. How do I figure out which language to speak when I first meet someone? Well, obviously, the first impression can not always be correct, because we tend to approach people in a fairly neutral way that doesn't disclose or reveal how we prefer to interact, how we prefer to communicate. But after a few sentences, after a minute or 3 of conversation, you should be able to zero in, especially if you've developed your knowledge of the languages. You should be able to zero in on what this person's primary style is. Is this an action person? Or is this a feeling person? Or is this a thinking person? Sometimes it'll be very clear from the way a person approaches you that they are one specific language. Other times you need to zero in through those intelligence categories. But either way, the practical day-to-day, moment-by-moment awareness of the 7 languages is what helps me to know where someone's coming from and therefore how best to connect with them. So I spend a lot of time looking over the characteristics and the qualities and the different attributes of each of the languages so that I internalize that knowledge. Just the same as my wife practices French and German and Spanish with one of those language learning apps because it keeps her fresh, not just with the grammar, but also the vocabulary. And that's the same with the life languages. The more I can internalize that knowledge, not so much as a task, but more as a daily experience. An analogy would be when you first get a new job, you often will need to use your GPS to get to the location. But after a few times of doing it, you're beginning to notice landmarks, you're beginning to notice which stoplight you turn at. You're building your knowledge of your route to your work. And then after a few days, you don't have to think about it anymore because you've internalized the facts and the details. Some of us internalize road numbers and lefts and rights. Others of us, I'm thinking of a friend, but others of us memorize landmarks or little prompts that help us to remember what to do. So I remember a friend of ours who said that the way to get to somewhere is to drive on this road until you see Benito's boats. And I had never even noticed Benito's boats until she'd said that. And then the next time I drove that route to go somewhere, it's one of the major routes out of town here in Myrtle Beach, but and actually Benito's boats is closed now, so don't take this and get lost. But I didn't see Benito's boats until she'd mentioned that as her landmark. And I then realized that we see things very differently. When I do route planning, I'm looking more at the highway numbers and where the next stoplight is or the next intersection. I put things into order in that way. She does things more pictorially, and seeing Benito's boats was her prompt that in a minute she's going to have to do something. So we work in different ways. Learning the details of each language is very similar to that process. Some of us do it by the way it feels. Some of us do it by actually memorizing the words. Some of us do it simply by jumping in and practically figuring it out in the midst of the conversation, sort of hands-on mode. But whichever way you do it, internalizing the characteristics of each language and keeping them clear in your understanding will really help you to know which language to speak when you meet someone. So I hope that helps, Carol. 2 more questions here and then we'll wrap it up. So Matt says, what are some steps to help a team of 3 work more closely together in a business? That's a really good question, and it's something that I love to do in the work I do with businesses and nonprofits. In fact, I've got a client right now that I'm beginning to work on this with, so that's a helpful question to ask me right now because I'm conscious of the answers. The first thing to do is to help the 3 people who are working together as a team to understand each other's profiles in a way of sort of self-disclosure. And one of the things I find myself having to do when we do that with a business team, this doesn't apply to the current setting, but it has helped in the past, is to help each person in that team of 3 to understand that they're just as valuable as the others in the team. Because very often in a team of 3, if the team's been assembled well, there are going to be a lot of differences. We had a whole episode on how to handle differences previously in the podcast, so go back and take another listen to that as well. But with a team, very commonly, I can either have too high of an opinion of what I bring versus what the others on the team bring, or I can more often have a lower opinion of my profile. There are some of the languages that tend to be more down on themselves than others. So, for example, the contemplator liking to think deeply and to be more to themselves may often feel like they don't make a contribution to the team. And so it's important for those who are maybe first language or high language contemplators to understand that the team needs the insights that they can discover by being themselves. That quest for knowledge, that inquisitiveness, that intelligence that they bring is vital for the team. Conversely, the doer language in the action category can often feel like they are laboring alone to get things done because the others want to do it differently, or they feel like they're not doing it right, or not doing it well enough, or not doing it to completion. The doers sometimes has to recognize that there's more than one way to do it. And one of the qualities the doer has to develop is delegation, or letting other people join in. And so, again, I help people to see that they don't need to be down on themselves. They have a valuable part to play in the picture of the team. Another thing that I do with teams is to help them to see which one has more to offer in different settings. So the different languages are more valuable in different ways. If we're dealing with a customer who has a problem or wants something to be solved, then some of the deeper thinking languages, particularly the strategic shaper or the resourceful managing producer, can be very valuable languages to bring to the fore. I may have that very low in my profile and find it a challenge, but there's probably somebody else in the team who scores higher with that, and we can lean into their skill and their experience and their understanding of that language to bring to the person what they need. Conversely, if the customer has got a complaint or an issue that needs to be resolved quickly, they need to know that we care. And again, understanding the customer in that way through the lens of the languages is also very helpful. But if there's a customer who needs to be received with empathy, then the responder language is going to be very good at doing that. To know that they're cared for, so that then they'll know that we care about what action we're taking on their behalf, or what steps we're going to take to resolve their problem. So these are areas where the team, seeing their different profiles, can really help one another to leverage their strengths and bring differences into being strengths. Because too often in teams, differences are what divide us and cause us to stumble, when actually the differences are what can give us the strength to succeed in settings where other teams would fail. One more thought on teams is that the members of the team, in their understanding of one another, need to get to the point where they each recognize each other's distress. So if someone's need is not being met, or if someone's contribution is not being valued, the rest of us can become sensitive to how they will express that, because it helps us, again, to maintain the health of the team in order for us to move forward. So all of those are ways that teams can work more closely together in a business. There's a lot more than that, obviously. Most of the time when I'm working with teams, we'll have 2 or 3 half-hour meetings to establish some of this. We'll take a 30-minute meeting, unpack some of this, and then give it a couple of weeks for the team to work on those things and to work with those things, and then get back together again, do a debrief, see what's been helpful, what other problems have we run into. So there's always that looking back to look forward, reviewing what's happened so that we can leap into success in addressing some of the things that have come to light. But again, the life languages give us the keys that we need to be able to know what to do. So I hope that helps you, Matt, and great credit to your team for wanting to work more closely together. If I can help you with that, let me know. And here's a final question from Joseph, who says, how can I connect better with others at school? Well, again, that depends on how you're wired, Joseph. It may be you're the kind of person who's very confident in yourself and you're very comfortable with yourself. You're maybe a lots of friends kind of guy. Or maybe you're more to yourself. Maybe you're more on the academic, intellectual end of the spectrum, if you like. And therefore it's harder to connect with others. Your question doesn't say that, but one of the ways you can connect better is to recognize where you're different from others. That's not to divide you, but like I said in the previous answer, our differences can become strengths if we recognize them and leverage them to build connections rather than to make divisions. Another thing is to recognize what you have to offer. Remember what we said about some of the team members in the previous answer. It's easy to be down on yourself if you're different from other people and think that you don't have anything to contribute, and therefore you don't actually reach out to make those kinds of connections. but actually recognizing that you need to connect or want to connect with your schoolmates, with your colleagues, is half the battle, because now you're seeing it and you're actually taking action toward that. So if you recognize what you have to offer, I'm thinking of one client of mine recently who was in a very similar situation. I think it was college rather than school, but high contemplator who found it difficult to make connections with other people, but saw the need to do that. And what I was able to help this person to do was to recognize, what do they bring? Their intelligence, their inquisitiveness, their ability to see more deeply than others, and to value that as a contribution to other people. And now they're beginning to see, yes, as they come into settings, particularly if there's a project to do or they're in a group work setting, they recognize that they may see things that others have missed. And now they're learning to step up and offer that. Now they're finding they're being appreciated for the strengths that they bring to the table. Every language has strengths to offer. Every language has a passion that is powerful when it's expressed. And my goal is to always help people not just to focus on their first language, but to bring a grouping of their stronger languages to the table in whatever setting it is, to recognize those strengths, to offer those strengths so that all of us can benefit. So here's my takeaway for today from all of these questions and answers, is that as you get to know yourself better, we can benefit from who you are because you understand yourself more clearly, more fully, and in a more rounded way. So please, over Thanksgiving, over the holidays, in the break between these two seasons, give yourself to others with that understanding of how I'm wired. And remember to keep your wiring, your understanding of your wiring, up to date as well. Some of you listening to this, it's probably been 2-3 years since you took your profile. It's probably time to do it again. So get on my website, send me a message, or click on the Take My Profile button, and let's get you refreshed in your understanding of yourself so that you can really give everyone around you the best you over the holidays and into the new year. So have a great time. I've got one more episode to come. We'll do a summary of this season. So see you again in a couple of weeks.